Let me start with a small introduction. William Felix Browder. Uh, we will talk mainly today about the Magnitsky affair, and of course, I would like to make a small introduction about yourself. You're originally from US. You have MBA at Stanford University. You're human rights activist. You're founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, which is the investment advisor to the largest foreign investment fund in Russia until 2005. And of course, the main thing I wanted to mention that you are an author of the book Red Notice, a true story of high finance murder and one man's fight for justice. About the book, I can see from the reviews that it says that it's one of the biggest tax fraud in the world ever. Around 230 million refund made in a day since filing the request, no questions asked. And Toronto Star has said that it's a tale that makes the dirty dealings of House of Cards look like Snow White. And the Guardian journalist said that it reads like non-fiction version of Mario Puzo thriller. So I guess these reflections say for themselves. But I would like to start a little bit about this joining this podcast. When I told some of my friends that I'm going to have a chat with you, one of them said probably there is something he wants to say. Why did you agree on such small new amateur project like this one?
Well, you wrote me a good email, and you you're working on important issues. You're from the Baltics, which is a very place close to my heart, and particularly the Baltics because this is where the main problems of Russian money laundering has come. It all came through the Baltics, and so I think that my message is important for your audience. And so I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for joining. I really thank you from bottom of my heart because I actually relate very much to the tax lawyer you hired, Mr. Magnitsky, and I remember shivers when I was reading Red Notice book and watching some of the videos available on YouTube on this story. More than 10 years have now passed since the Magnitsky affair and writing the Red Notice. What has been your daily agenda since then? Any business or human rights activities besides the Magnitsky case?
No, so Sergey Magnitskiy was murdered on November 16, 2009, and we're now coming up to the 12th year after his murder. And I continue to focus my life on going after the people who killed him and making them face justice. It's the campaign has definitely gone beyond Sergey, though, in the sense that the Magnitsky Act, which is the legislation which is named after him, is now applicable not just to his own killers, but to human rights violators all over the world. And so the legislation also exists now in 33 countries. And so my main activity has been to get the Magnitsky Act passed in different countries, and then to have it become used in different countries against the people who killed Sergey and the people who do other terrible things. And it's now becoming a sort of, I would call it the new standard for human rights enforcement.
Yeah, definitely. We will, our main part of the podcast will be dedicated to Magnitsky affair, and we will talk in length about this, but still about yourself. Would you be so kind and share what is on your reading table right now and any books that have changed or significantly impacted your life that you would like to recommend?
Well, there's another book which I've just recently finished reading, It's called Red Roulette. Red Roulette. So my book is called Red Notice. Red Roulette is written by a Chinese man who I know, who was a businessman in China, and he was married to a businesswoman in China, his wife, and they had huge business success. And a lot of their success was the result of them cutting in members of the Chinese Communist Party into their deals. And then all of a sudden, his wife was effectively kidnapped by the Chinese state and has disappeared 4 years ago. And he wrote a book, this Red Roulette, and he has done something that no one else has ever done, which is he exposed the inner workings of how the Chinese Communist Party shares proceeds with these businessmen like himself and his wife. And the book was published earlier this week. And the day before publication, for the first time in 4 years, he heard from his wife, who called him up from having been released from detention to say that he shouldn't publish the book. I thought it was all very, very interesting and dramatic. And his book is a good book, and it really lifts the curtain on China. And I encourage everyone to go out and read this book, and particularly read it because the Chinese government so desperately doesn't want you to read it.
Yeah, wow. It's easy to remember, Red Notice and Red Roulette. I saw a reference to that book on your Twitter account, so it's easy to find also that way.
Yeah.
You have also initially worked for a Boston Consulting Group, focusing, of course, everybody knows this large company, and you were focusing on Eastern Europe. From today's perspective, do you see common trends in the Eastern European economies, what they should be doing in order to increase prosperity there?
Well, so when I started my career, I was interested in Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe was sort of a catch-all. And within Eastern Europe, there were the countries of Central Europe. They were considered Eastern Europe, countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, and it also included countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, etc. And what's really happened is that the Eastern European countries that became part of Europe have all and taken on the values, rule of law, democracy, freedom of the press. They've all prospered dramatically compared to 25 years ago. And the countries that were all sort of part of the Russian sphere, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, have all stagnated because of the dictatorship, lack of rule of law, and so on. And it's just like totally different outcomes. And it's just such a reminder of the importance of democracy and the rule of law in economics.
Sure, and we should appreciate what we have, where we are right now. Then, of course, turning to our main story about the Magnitsky case, you probably have a short version of the Magnitsky case story for those who are not aware of it. Would you please share it?
Of course. So, I mean, I can share it over 11 hours, or I can share it over 30 seconds. And I've learned actually to become very fluent at sharing it quickly, because in order to get legislators in different countries to pass Magnitsky Act, sometimes I only have 45 seconds of their attention. And so in very
elevator
quick terms,
pitch, yeah,
the elevator pitch. And so in very quick terms, the Magnitsky story is all about. So I went to Russia to set up the largest investment fund in Russia. When I got there, I discovered that the companies I invested in were corrupt because the oligarchs were stealing money. I decided to fight the corruption by exposing it. I was successful in exposing it and fighting it for some period of time. But as you can imagine, the corrupt individuals who I was exposing weren't too happy about that. And I was eventually expelled from the country, declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided, in Moscow after I was expelled. And I hired a young lawyer named Sergey Magnitskiy to investigate. And Sergey investigated the office raids and determined that the purpose of these raids was to steal $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government. And they succeeded. They stole $230 million of taxes, which is the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. Sergey and I were convinced that this must be a rogue operation. And because Putin, he might have authorized his officials to steal our money, but to steal their own tax money is sort of, kind of cannibalizing themselves. And so we thought if we just brought it to the attention of the right authorities, that the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And so we wrote criminal complaints to every different branch of Russian law enforcement. And Sergey gave sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, and we waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. It turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys, and then shortly after he testified, he was arrested by the same people he testified against, thrown in pretrial detention. He was tortured for 358 days, and he was ultimately killed at the age of 37 on November 16, 2009. And since then, I've made it my life's work to go after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And I've given up my life as a businessman to become a full-time human rights activist. And the big result of the work that I've done over the last 12 years is the Magnitsky Act, which imposes visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergey and the people who commit similar human rights abuses. And that's now a law that exists in 33 countries around the world, and hopefully more in the future. I'm going to ask you to hold for 1 second. I'm going to go to a different room because there's construction going on, which I don't want to have picked up on your tape here. So give me 1 second while I move
no
my device. Okay, we can start again.
All right. I, as our podcast is called Tech Stories, I want to dig deeper a little bit about the technical part of the tax fraud. Can we please go into how was it possible to defraud the Russian state? Did they just claim to the tax authorities that we have paid 230 million by mistake, and please pay us back? What was
much cleverer than that? So what happened was after I was expelled from Russia, I looked at our situation and I said, getting kicked out is one thing, and it's not good, but it's definitely a very minor sanction compared to what they could do to us. What could they do? They could arrest my employees, or they could steal our assets. And so I said, we need to get our people out, and I evacuated all of our people. And then once the people were evacuated, we quickly and quietly sold every last share we held in Russia. And off of those sales, we had $1 billion of profits. And off those $1 billion of profits, we paid $230 million of capital gains tax. And so what happened was the police raided our offices about a year after we paid the taxes. And they seized all of our documents. And the documents they seized were like the stamps and seals and certificates for these investment companies that had sold all these assets. And then with these documents, they fraudulently re-registered the companies out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early. So the police seize our documents and then use those documents to conduct an identity theft and re-registering it from us to this killer.
So it's
Now,
a clear link to basically the source of the re-registration of the title to the companies, right?
correct. So they took all the stuff needed to re-register the companies, and then the companies get re-registered. Okay, so the bad guys now own the companies. So that once they own the companies, they then create a bunch of fake contracts. And those fake contracts claim that these companies, which are now empty, by the way, because we had taken all our money out, that these companies owed $1 billion to a bunch of empty shell companies. So they make up these backdated fake contracts, claim that these companies, our former companies, our stolen companies, owed $1 billion to these other companies. And then after that, these bad guys take these contracts to court. And so these shell companies that are owed this money, these fake contracts, sue our stolen companies for the money. And they go to 3 courts in Russia. They go to courts in St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Moscow. And in court, lawyers go in representing the shell companies that are owed the money, and then another set of lawyers go in representing our stolen companies. But in both cases, the lawyers were all part of the same team. So, and then the lawyers who represented our companies pled guilty to $1 billion of fake liabilities. And the judge said, well, I don't see anything unusual here, even though 2 parties were fighting over $1 billion. One of them just agrees in court. And so he then stamps the judgment for $1 billion. And with this judgment, they then go to the tax authorities and say, look, last year, we want to file an amended tax return. Last year, these companies claimed that they earned $1 billion, but we now have these judgments that say that they owed $1 billion. And so 1 billion minus $1 billion equals 0. So they say we want to update our tax return to say that these companies actually earned 0 in the previous year. Therefore, $230 million of taxes that were paid previously was paid in error. And they applied for a $230 million tax refund on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas, and it was approved and paid out the next day. So imagine someone's applying for a $230 million tax refund. And if you're in the tax business, you'll know that, applying for a $5,000 tax refund, it takes a year or 2 years, whatever. They applied for a $230 million tax refund. It was approved and paid out in 1 day. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, paid out in 1 day on a fraud. And so it became clear to us that this was that must have involved rogue tax officials. It certainly involved rogue police officers, and it definitely involved criminals like this guy who was convicted of manslaughter. And so it's basically a conspiracy involving many different branches of the Russian government.
Oh, there was a similar amount, I think, defrauded in Denmark as well, where there was withholding tax refunded, but these are quite different circumstances. Where in that case,
I think the Danish story was all about dividend withholding taxes that were, I don't remember the details, but this was just absolute, so this was forgery, this was corruption, right. This was murder. The Danish thing was just like I don't think it involved the Danish authorities, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, that was just I understand the mistake by the tax authorities, whereas this looks like a large theater scene. How Magnitsky found that this fraud was it so obvious?
No, it was not obvious at all. So at first we were all scratching our heads, like why would they steal a bunch of empty investment holding companies? And
Right.
it didn't make any sense because they were empty.
Mm.
And then it was just a pure accident that a bailiff contacted our office, bailiff from one of these courts, and said, "I'm here. I'm it's my job to collect this $1 billion." And we said, $1 billion? What are you talking about? And they said, yeah, there's this $1 billion judgment. We had no idea, and we'd never been to court. We'd never been notified of a case. And so we sent our lawyers to court, and the lawyers copied these judgments. And then we got these judgments, and it was like shocking, $1 billion of judgments that we didn't know about, with all these lawyers pleading guilty and so on. But then we still said to ourselves, why in the world would anyone need $1 billion of judgments against empty companies that have no longer assets in them? And we were scratching our heads, and Sergey was sort of going around to all different tax offices and registration offices around Russia, trying to figure out what was going on. And there's one other detail, which is that once our companies were stolen, they kept on being re-registered from one registration office to another. And so he would go around the country where all these where all of our companies, our stolen companies, have been re-registered, asking them for information. Most of them would ignore his requests, but one office sent him a note saying the companies have been registered here. This was in a district outside Moscow called Khimki, which is where the Sheremetyevo airport is located. And the Khimki tax office sent him a note saying the companies are registered here, and they have bank accounts at the Universal Savings Bank. And we were like, what's the Universal Savings Bank? We had never heard of this bank. And Sergey looked it up, and the Universal Savings Bank was the 920th largest bank in Russia. Okay, it was not even a bank. Okay, so Universal Savings Bank had one branch located in a derelict building, and total capital of $1.5 million. And so, but this was their big mistake, because it was such a small bank with only $1.5 million. He could then look on the Central Bank of Russia's website, and the Central Bank website shows, aggregate assets of all banks. It's just like public information. And what he saw on the Central Bank's website was it went from $1.5 million of capital of total assets to $231.5 million of total assets after the bank accounts had been set up by our 3 stolen companies. Right. And so we said, wait a second, that's the exact amount of money we paid in taxes. And then we went back and were able to probe more deeply and determined that yes, indeed, that there was this tax refund.
Right. And was it easy to trace the money afterwards from this bank? Where did it go further?
Well, this is what I've been working on for the last 12 years. And so we've now traced the money, and we've traced the money to many, many countries. But the biggest country where the money flowed to initially after leaving Russia was Estonia. The money went to Danske Bank, Estonia. And then it went on to many other places, including the United States, Switzerland, Spain, France, UK, Canada, Germany, Poland, etc. But all the money was originally laundered through Moldova, Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And so these were what I call the transit countries.
Right. And looking at this money tracing after what happened, do you see it as a global problem with regard to banks all over the world not knowing well enough about the money flows through their banks and about the offshore company structure in the world? How is it possible and easy now to use offshore companies? Do you see it as a pure like local problem or a global problem?
Well, so I think you're giving these people the benefit of the doubt. And so a lot of people did this with full cognizance. So just to give you an example, Danske Bank in Estonia had a 412% return on equity. So the small bank had a 412% return on equity. The average return on equity for a bank is like 10 to 15%. And so if you were the CEO of Danske Bank in Denmark and you see a branch with that type of profitability, you have to ask yourself, what's going on there? Why is it so profitable? I'd just like to know.
Sure.
And I'm sure he did know, because I can't. It's inconceivable that he didn't ask that question. And so I think that there's a lot of situations where people knew what was going on, and they just chose to take the profits and look the other way. The other thing which I've learned over the last 12 years is the complete and utter failure of the Western law enforcement system to be able to prosecute these types of cases. Many countries have really, really deficient law enforcement, and also many countries have deficient laws that allow them to prosecute this. So one of the most important concepts in law is that there has to be a predicate offense in order to prosecute money laundering. A predicate offense means you have to be able to prove that a crime took place at the original source. In order to prove a predicate offense, you have to get evidence from Russia, from the Russian government. And if the Russian government is involved in these crimes, then they're not going to give you the evidence. And so many countries can't even prosecute, even if they want to, and even if they have the capacity and the capability to prosecute, they can't go about it. And so what's happening now in the West is they're starting to change the laws. They just did so in the UK very recently, where instead of proving that the money was of a criminal origin, they now have a new law called the Unexplained Wealth Order, which says that if money seems suspicious, the law enforcement doesn't have to prove that the money came from crime, but the person who has the money has to prove that it didn't come from crime.
Sure. But I must say that I'm not a banking law or AML law specialist, but I'm a tax specialist. So I wanted to ask you about this offshore or shell company structure that is possible throughout the world right now. By tracing those assets throughout the world for those many years now, do you see a sort of quick fix or how this can be the existing system can be cured? Can it be cured that taxes are not evaded through offshores and assets are not hidden in the offshores?
Well, the easiest way to fix it is to just create transparency. If like Cyprus, for example, is they have full public access to ownership of companies. That's good. Panama and the British Virgin Islands don't. And so as long as you have offshore jurisdictions where there's no transparency, you have a problem. Similarly, we're now in a world where there's a lot of data sharing going on. So, the Channel Islands in the UK have information sharing with the HMRC, the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and so people can't, cheat through the Channel Islands. I mean, there's legitimate reasons to have offshore companies if you have like multinational businesses, for complicated families with estate planning in different jurisdictions, and there's illegitimate reasons to have offshore companies, which are hiding, money laundering or tax evasion. And as long as the transparency exists and as long as there's information sharing, then offshore companies shouldn't be a problem. But there's a lot of people, a lot of little offshore jurisdictions that are resisting that.
How to force them to open up the transparency?
Well, it's very easy to force them. You put them on a blacklist, and you can, just like with unexplained wealth orders, you should assume that every company in a blacklisted jurisdiction is for money laundering and tax evasion purposes. That will get them. They'll change their laws very quickly.
And why it's not done?
Well, I think that there's it's getting done. I mean, I know many people in the UK Parliament that are pushing very hard on this, and then there's there's definitely resistance from these places. But I don't think that. I think in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, there'll be no such thing as secret offshore jurisdictions.
Hopefully. Going back to Magnitsky, when hiring Sergey to dig deeper into this story, what exactly was his task, and did you sense that it could be life-threatening to him?
Well, so his task was to research the whole raid of our offices, the criminal allegations they made against my colleagues in order to justify the raids, and to find out why they did this and how we could stop it. And it was originally it was sort of a defense lawyer type of job because we had been targeted. But the more we looked into it, the more we realized that this was not just defense. This was like, we had to go on the attack because we were. It wasn't just about criminal allegations. They were basically going to frame us for their crime. And it wasn't like the day that we hired Sergey, I had no idea that it would be dangerous. But the more we discovered, the more shocking it became. And the higher up it went into the Russian government and the more money that was involved, the more shocking it became. And I became truly scared by the time all the whole thing blew up.
And he refused to stop. Yeah.
Well, and in fact, after he discovered the tax, he wasn't the only lawyer working for us. We also had 2 other lawyers. And by the time we discovered the $230 million tax refund, they were starting to go after the lawyers. And so they had summoned the 2 other lawyers to come to Kazan in Tatarstan for interrogation. And this place in Kazan where they summoned them was a place where like male detainees were raped with champagne bottles and all sorts of really horrible stuff. And so the moment that they were summoned, those 2 lawyers fled the country, and we got them safely out. And I told Sergey to flee as well. And he hadn't been summoned yet. And he said, "No, I'm not going to flee. I've not done anything wrong. This is not 1937, referring to Stalin's time in Russia." And he stayed. And it was really a terrible. It was a terrible mistake for me not to have pushed him harder to leave.
Right.
And that I think about that every day.
I see. After all this happened, I've read that there have been several investigations in some of the countries. Like I've heard there was one in Cyprus. Have you heard what has it resulted in some convictions?
So there are 16 countries that open criminal investigations. The United States was the most prominent of which, and on the date of the trial, the Russian bad guys paid a $6 million settlement to the U.S. government in order to avoid the trial. And that was in addition to the $15 or $20 million of legal fees they paid to try to avoid the trial. So even though it wasn't a conviction, it was sort of certainly a big punishment to them.
Wow.
But we've also had a couple of convictions in Latvia. The Latvian authorities have convicted and seized property. The Belgian authorities have seized property and convicted. There's various strands of a major criminal case in France where they've seized money. Switzerland seized $20 million that belonged to a lot of these bad guys, and then came up with an irrational decision very recently that they're going to seize 4 million of the 20 and give 16 of it back to the criminals, which is really kind of unbelievable. And then places like Cyprus, they opened a criminal case, didn't lift a finger. And you have the worst possible story, which is the UK, where we found more money than any place, and they never even opened a criminal investigation.
And why do you think is that?
I think that it's a combination of laziness, greed, greed meaning that the British government doesn't want to cut off the flow of Russian money coming into the city of London, and maybe even a little bit of corruption.
Mm-hmm. I saw you also went to European Court of Human Rights. How did it go, and what is the aftermath to the judgment? To me, this 34,000 euros seemed to be quite a ridiculous amount.
Yeah. Well, when I first started my whole campaign for justice for Sergey, I had no legal training whatsoever, and so I went around and asked people, what should we do? And the first thing everyone said is go to the European Court of Human Rights. And I was very skeptical from the very beginning because the European Court of Human Rights takes forever to issue a decision. I think it took 9 years in our case. The European Court of Human Rights doesn't issue a decision against any individuals. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody gets custodial sentences. It issues a decision against the country. And then the total amount of the decision is like, 35 or 50,000 euros. And how can that be? How can that be right when a person has been tortured and killed? And that's exactly what happened. So in the end, we got a decision. It took about 9 or 10 years. There's a decision in favor of Sergey's widow and mother for 50,000 euros that determined that the Russian government had violated his right to life. It's it's good to have. It's a judgment against the Russian Federation. It's a validation of our outrage, but that's all it is. But the more powerful consequence for Russia has been the Magnitsky Act. That individuals who were involved, many of them, I think there's about 35 people who were involved in Sergey Magnitsky's false arrest, torture, and death, are now on the sanctions list in the United States, the UK, Canada, and pretty much, I think that they will have trouble applying to visas to any civilized countries in addition to those 3 countries, and they probably won't be able to open bank accounts anywhere in the world. And that's certainly not justice as I would hope, but it's better than total impunity.
Right. What would be justice in your perspective?
Justice, in my perspective, is very simple. The people who tortured and killed Sergey Magnitsky are found guilty for torture and murder and sentenced to jail for a very long time.
Right. And I saw on YouTube there is a sequence of videos about tracing the assets of those persons. And what now, looking more than 10 years back since it happened, what have you heard? What has happened to those against whom the Magnitsky laws have been passed?
Well, so those people are not happy. I mean, they're really very unhappy. So a lot of these police officers are no longer with the police, and because every time they were with the police after the Magnitsky case, anything that they did, they got publicized, and the police, when they do their shakedowns in Russia, they don't want to have lightning rod people exposing other corruption. I mean, being exposed. I mean, they don't want their scams to be exposed by having these, radioactive people on their teams. So these guys got fired, and then they had trouble doing business. One of them, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Artem Kuznetsov, who was the one who led the raid on our offices, after he was in the police. I should say, while he was in the police, he realized there was a big scam going on with people with hospitals buying equipment. He understood that there was huge kickbacks going on. A hospital would buy an MRI machine for $100,000 that really only cost 50, and then they would, divide up the 50. And so after he left the police force, so he was investigating that. After he left the police force, he got into the medical supply business, and we discovered that he was sourcing his equipment from Philips in the Netherlands. And so we wrote a criminal complaint, or a complaint to the U.S. Treasury, saying that Philips was in violation of the U.S. Magnitsky Act because it was doing business with a sanctioned individual. And so all of a sudden, all of his partners and intermediaries couldn't have him on the team anymore because he was a lightning rod, sanctioned by the U.S. government. And so I think his life has been definitely badly affected by this.
Yeah, sounds like a lot is going on. Do you have a big team for chasing these individuals?
Well, our team is very big in the sense that there's many people who are involved, who are not working for me formally, but who have either become information suppliers, whistleblowers, pro bono lawyers, PR assistants, and so on. And so I would say there's probably 500 people around the world that have assisted us in one way or another. But in terms of actual people who are employed, it's just a really dozen people or so who are working on this actually physically in my office.
Right. Quite impressive. I wanted to ask also about the German journal Der Spiegel, which is in my eyes quite reputable journal. I saw they published a series of articles saying that not everything might be as you told. Why do you think they did it? And I had the impression that they are sort of being picky on details, but still the main picture remains as it was. So, what's your take on that?
Well, the guy who wrote it, so Der Spiegel has written some good stuff, but it's like every institution has good people and has bad people, and the guy who wrote it, I can't remember his name anymore, but we looked into him, and he, if you look at his history, he has a history of sort of doing sympathetic, sometimes, not always, but doing some sympathetic things to the Putin regime, and why did he choose to do that? I don't know. Maybe they were blackmailing him, or I mean, everybody. He was living in Moscow for a really long time. Maybe somehow they got to him. I don't know for sure, but what I can say is that his findings and his accusations are contradicted by just about every government in the world, and contradicted by most other journalists in the world. And so you have to ask yourself, what, is he smarter than everybody else and we're all just so stupid, or maybe there's something else to the story?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think all most of the readers will see it that way as well. If we look at the offshore system as it is right now, and if we look, for example, if we look at London and other big cities in the world, a lot of real estate there belongs to offshores. Can it be so that you stay one day in a property, let's say a hotel, belonging to people who did the tax fraud Magnitsky was killed for?
Well, I think that as time goes on, as I said before, I think this offshore secrecy thing is going to fully disappear. I don't think that that's something that's really going to be in place 5 to 10 years from now. But that is a problem right now, and it's something which I find, and I think a lot of people find, that London is kind of I would call it the money laundering capital of the world. And yes, there are. I don't think that. I'd be very surprised if any Magnitsky killers own hotels that anyone's going to stay in, but they might own a valuable piece of property or whatever, if I'm looking for a house, I'll be sure not to buy any house from a Russian seller.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a company as a seller or as an owner of property, then probably sometimes it's difficult to trace who is behind that company right now.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I hope this global minimum taxation will be a part of this solution as well.
Well, I think that everything is moving in that direction, so we'll see.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, Bill Browder, I think I've gone through all my questions, and as traditionally, I conclude my podcast with a question I ask to every of my guests. What would be your version of meaning of life for you?
Well, I think I've sort of found the meaning of life, which is to find a cause that's greater than oneself, that a mission that you can pursue, which makes the world a better place. And I started my life, my career in a fight for money. I was a Wall Street shark fighting for money, and I've graduated to fighting for justice, and fighting for justice is infinitely more satisfying than fighting for money.
Right. With those words, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude our podcast. And Bill, I'm truly thankful for your time and for your effort to joining us today. So, thank you.
Thank you.